Welcome to the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, silly, sublime, and strange aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, who are the go-to parent, aren't always accepted at work, among their friends, or in the community for what they're doing. I'm your host, Paul Sullivan. Our podcast is just one of many things we produce each week at the Company of Dads. We have various features, including the Lead Dad of the Week. We have our community, both online and in person, and we have a new resource library for all fathers. The one-stop shop for all of this is our newsletter, The Dad. Sign up at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Today, my guest is Linda Nielsen, a professor of education at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. She's an internationally recognized expert on father-daughter relationships. And most recently, she's the author of a book, Myths and Lies About Dads, with the subtitle, How They Hurt Us All. She's also written two previous books on father-daughter relationships and how to improve them. As a dad of three daughters from kindergarten to middle school, I'm quite excited for our conversation today. Professor Nielsen, welcome to the Company of Dads podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Great to have you. Start off with the easiest question. How did this become your area of study and research? How did it all begin?
Well, 35 years ago, I became very interested in father-daughter relationships because my own father had died recently, which always makes us reflective, I think, about our relationship with that parent. But I had also been studying or writing for years about adolescence. And I realized that in the adolescent psychology books, there was a lot about fathers and sons, a lot about mothers and daughters, a lot about mothers and sons, but there was very little in those books about fathers and daughters. And I wondered why. Mm-hmm. When I Googled, went to Amazon Books, there were no books at that time, 35 years ago, on father-daughter relationships. So I decided to fill the gap. And I began writing and teaching about fathers and daughters and have taught, still teaching, the only course in the country, college course, that's exclusively devoted to father-daughter relationships, which again was very surprising because on college campuses, there are many courses on mother-daughter relationships. But again, we sort of seemed to hit the Alt-Delete button when it came to fathers and daughters. So I picked that up as my research passion and personal passion.
It's fascinating because, knowledge, academia is usually an iterative process. You're building on things that have come before you and you're asking different questions. But, when you think about 35 years ago, there's nothing out there and you really start this field. What were some of the first questions that you started to ask back then? And what were some of the first things that you learned back then?
I think the first thing I learned was how important fathers were in terms of their impact on daughters. Mm-hmm. There was a lot there that surprised me. And also, as I started to encounter for this new book, there's so many negative stereotypes and myths about fathers that undermine that father-daughter relationship, that undermine men's relationships with their sons too. But again, my focus was on the father-daughter bond and realizing how those myths and stereotypes work against the kind of meaningful relationship that fathers and daughters could otherwise have together. And that I still see those myths and stereotypes. They're like zombies and vampires. You think you've gotten rid of them and you take a big sigh of relief and then all of a sudden it's gotcha. They're out there again. They keep like rising up, which I find not amusing, but really very, very disturbing.
A couple of, several episodes, a dozen episodes back, we had on Stu Friedman, who's a professor at the Wharton School. And back in the 80s, shortly after he became a dad, he started researching workplace dynamics and changing gender policies and, why allowing both men and women to be caregivers at work would be significant both for them as people, for the families, but also for the company at large. And at the time, he was an untenured professor, and his colleagues at Wharton said, Stu, what in the world are you doing? You're going to screw up your career. Focus on something else. And he persisted, and now, 35 years later, he's one of the leading experts in this space, and he's advised all kinds of big companies. What did your colleagues at Wake Forest say, in the education department when 35 years ago, you started to delve into this area and started to do, research on it?
I would say it was sort of a shrug, like, okay, but that's sort of a little niche. Well, I don't consider that a little niche of research when you're talking about, half of the children are daughters, half of the parents are fathers. I'd say that's a pretty big darn niche.
Yep.
So it was sort of a shrug. Oh, well, okay, that's nice. Instead of taking it as seriously as we should because of the ramifications it has for daughters.
And talk about that when we'll get to your new book in a couple minutes, but talk about what you've learned and how the field and how the study of this has changed over the past 3 decades, both for the positive and the areas where there's still a lot of work to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, the positive is, as we're seeing in the media and in podcasts like this one and in your company of dads, we are seeing more attention being paid to the role of fathers. The progress, yes, but how much progress? And that's what concerns me. For example, paternity leaves. There has not been much progress made there in terms of offering those leaves to fathers, treating them seriously, making fathers feel very comfortable and welcome to take those leaves. There's still a lot of prejudice there in terms of the roles that we expect fathers to play. Or we look at the media and see one of the most popular myths is that you guys are slouches on couches. You're just not doing your share of the work to raise children. I see that myth every week in the media, in jokes, in t-shirts, in Father's Day cards, the myth of the lazy father. That myth damages fathers' relationships with their children. It damages fathers' relationships with their spouses because everyone believes the myth. Why don't we look at what the U.S. Census Department tells us? And the U.S. Census Department does surveys, national surveys, to look at how mothers and fathers spend their time every week. And they look at these surveys all year long. This is data all year long.
Yeah.
The bottom line is moms and dads do equal numbers of work hours on behalf of their children, about 62 hours a week. It's a lot of work.
It's a lot, yeah.
They do different kinds of work to contribute to their children. 2/3 of the families have the fathers do most of the financial child care. Okay. 2/3 of the fathers are carrying most or all of that burden of child care. The mothers are carrying 2/3 of the work of the more direct child care. But the myth says that the dads are just lying around, leisure loafing, lollygagging, whatever you guys do, while the mothers are raising your children. That is a very, very damaging and very serious and very popular myth.
Yeah, last year I was out in Los Angeles, invited out by this group Equimundo. You may know them, the founder, a guy named Gary Barker, and he had teamed up with the Gina Davis Institute to do a study of popular perceptions of caregivers and fathers in TV and movies. And of course, it was the father was angry, absent, abusive, bumbling. And it was powerful because, they're being played for laughs sometimes, they're being played for pathos sometimes. but they're sticky, and you see them, often enough, and it becomes this sort of, as you said, it's a myth, but it's self-reinforcing. How do we work to break the myths? Obviously, it's something very important to us at the company does, but when you think of ways that this myth here, and I love the 62-hour stat, how do we begin to break that myth and present more reality?
Okay, let's look at what women did or what any other marginalized group has done to try to change the stereotypes that were hurting them, hurting their children, hurting their families. Look at what women have done in the last 30 years. It started with children's toys. Okay, there was a Barbie doll years ago, that a little talking Barbie doll, and it said, "I hate math class."
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
was one of the things that
Yes.
Barbie said. "I hate math class. Math class is hard." Well, the feminists went crazy about that. They said you're feeding a myth. It's a dangerous myth. It's a myth that costs women money because you're keeping them out of STEM jobs. You're discouraging little girls. That Barbie doll was yanked from the shelf faster than you could say Jackrabbit. It was gone.
Yeah.
So we start with toys. We start with children's books where you don't portray women and girls as being too stupid to do science and math. So if we use those same strategies, toys, children's books, sitcoms, would you make the same kind of sitcoms about mothers that you do about fathers? I don't think so.
Right.
Would you make the same kind of Father's Day cards that are supposed to be funny? I don't see those cards at Mother's Day.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any Mother's Day
Yeah.
cards making fun of mothers with their feet propped up drinking beer,
You're
you
right.
know, or Chardonnay, I guess, in the case of the mom, if you want to say. So if you start with those small steps for young children, okay, and then build our movies, our sitcoms, our advertising, our commercials, would you make fun of mothers the same way you make fun of fathers in commercials? No, you would not. But we still do this.
Yep.
And in fact, in many countries, including South Africa, India, and the UK, they have banned making commercials that stereotype men or women in negative ways. But we still apparently find it funny.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Yeah.
find it funny. As a father, I would be very offended by those commercials and those sitcoms and those Father's Day cards. So if we follow these same patterns that women followed, from yanking those Barbie dolls off those shelves to repackaging toys, how about toys for little boys?
Mm-hmm.
Toys where they are nurturing their babies, where they are taking care of babies, where they are not being made fun of for taking care of their baby dolls. We did it when it came to changing the roles and creating more freedom for women and girls. We're not doing that so well for boys and men when it comes to creating future fathers. What
Mm-hmm.
are we setting out there for future fathers? The male students in my fathers and daughters class, when they come in there, they honest to goodness believe that there's such a thing as maternal instinct that women have and men don't have,
Mm-hmm.
and that make women superior to men in taking care of babies. That's a myth.
Mm-hmm. And
Those
it's a hurtful myth for women as well as men.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, because if we believe just that myth, then you're going to expect the mother to be the one to take more of the time off work, to do the maternity leave, to make the concessions to take care of that baby because you believe she's superior.
Mm-hmm.
If we could dismantle that vampire zombie myth, if we could kill that off, think of the wider choices, the greater freedom that the moms and the dads would have to make choices that they felt better suited their particular family, their particular personality. Those young men in my class are future fathers. They believe, they believe that women are more empathic, more compassionate, better at communicating than men. That is a myth. These young men have bought the myth. If they believe that, then that is how they will behave. Because if
Sure.
we buy the stereotype, then we act in accord with that stereotype and we reinforce the stereotype. So now we're in a really bad circle in the way that if little girls believe they can't do math and science, complete the path over the next 15 years, they won't go into those areas. So the myths that I'm addressing in the book are myths that hold fathers back from being the kind of fathers they could be, and it holds the mothers back from making choices that they could make if they didn't believe the myth.
You know,
Everybody wins.
I agree. I mean, I had this conversation a couple weeks back with a major insurance company about coming in and giving a talk to one of their parenting groups. And they liked, what we were proposing. We went back and forth, and then they came back a couple days later with an email saying, we really would like to bring the company dads in. However, we feel right now we haven't been doing enough for women at work, and so therefore we want to keep our parenting group focused on moms. And I wrote back to them. I said, what you're doing that you think is positive is actually negative. If you don't include dads in these parenting groups, then it's going to persist at your very large insurance company that all caregiving roles, all parenting roles are going to fall to those working moms. And those working moms, whether consciously or not, are going to be stigmatized at work. They're going to be seen as less committed or unable to put in the hours, when there could very well be a father who, short of giving birth and breastfeeding, we obviously believe at the company of dads that a father can do everything else. These are so many of the tasks that get assigned as gender to get assigned to moms are really, logistics, planning, operations, things that you would do in any workplace. But when big companies, believe that, and they're setting and they're speaking with their policies and their leave plans and their dollars and their promotions, how do we start to, combat those myths that, I'm not going to name the insurance company, but everybody listening would know it. How do we start, combating those myths in corporate America that are, persisting, holding back both fathers and mothers?
We have to find a way to get the research through to them. For example, if companies understood the bottom line, cold hard cash, you will make more money if your fathers get paternity leave, paid paternity leave, full pay, paid paternity leave, not for a week or two, but maybe up to 5 or 6 weeks, or even extending the number of days that they could use later to take off time to care for their children. What we've seen is that the economists who have looked at this is the company saves money when they do that, because those men are more productive, less depressed, less missing time off because they are drinking too much or too stressed. Or you will make more money by investing up front in these fathering programs. If we could see that this helps not only the bottom line for the company, it helps the mothers, because it takes the pressure off this. If we can get rid of the stereotype, it takes the pressure off the mother to have to be the caregiver. It gives her more freedom. It gives the father more freedom. But the ultimate person who wins here is the kids.
Yeah.
It's the kids who win, because we know that, contrary to the myth, fathers have as great or greater impact than mothers do on children. I'll give you a quick example. A baby is born premature. Okay, we know that preemies have future problems, physical health, and catching up with cognitive development. Kangaroo care. Have you ever heard of kangaroo care?
No.
No. Okay. Kangaroo care came along, was a concept developed years ago, maybe 10 years ago, where the premature baby is in the intensive care unit, of course. What they started doing was have the mothers come into the intensive care unit and hold the baby up against her bare chest.
Yep.
And what they found was when that happened, the premature baby and the mother, their stress hormones went down, blood pressure lowered, calm, the stress reduced. But what was interesting wasn't that, it was that years later, those premature babies who got the kangaroo care, I don't know where they came up with kangaroo care, I guess because it was like holding it like a pouch.
Yeah.
I don't know kangaroo research. That those babies, years later, had better physical health and cognitive development, had better cognitive skills than the premature babies who hadn't been held like that. But nobody ever thought to include the papa kangaroos.
Right.
Now we've done research, there are 13 studies now, that the fathers who hold those premature babies against his bare chest, it's the skin to skin contact, the warmth, the hearing the heartbeat, the holding that baby against his chest. Wow, Papa Kangaroo had the same impact that Mama Kangaroo had. So now we can have two kangaroos in the infant care, taking care of that premature baby. That's huge.
Yeah.
Who's ever heard of it?
You're right. Tell me this though. You said something before that about how, there is research that the importance of having a father involved is as important, and you also said, if not more important than the mom. And I've seen this research, and it's often labeled as controversial. It's controversial, and I don't. Maybe are we not allowed to say that there can be equal parenting? And what makes it, controversial, and what makes it something that is often, caveated to say that a father is just as important and, in a child's life as a mother?
Let's forget mothers and fathers for a minute. Let's go back 50 years in terms of race, racial differences. 50 years ago, when we started coming out with research showing that some of these beliefs that we had about racial differences were not true, people got threatened. Let's just say it. White people got threatened. White people, many white people were initially threatened by that research, made them uncomfortable, went against our expectations, okay, made us maybe not feel quite so special because we saw that other groups were more like us than we imagined. Moving forward, as we get more of that research into the general public, or as we get more of that research into the general public of women can do math and science, men don't have to feel threatened by that.
Mm-hmm.
So if we use that as a parallel, right now, it's possible that certain groups may feel threatened, may feel uncomfortable with the idea that men can do parenting as well as women. Certain groups may find that news, that research, very threatening, scary.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to take my role away. You're going to take you're going to do something that will make me feel less good about myself. So I think that's just typical, that's usual, that's normal when one group has to confront research that threatens in some way the position that they have traditionally held. To turn that around, we might say men might 50 years ago have felt threatened or uncomfortable with the idea of their wives making as much money as the man makes.
Yep.
That's less threatening now because the stereotype is changing. And we now have the research. 50 years ago, there was research saying, or people thought, that if mothers left their children in childcare, that terrible things were going to happen to your baby. Mommy, you cannot go to work. You must stay home with baby. You cannot put that baby into a daycare center 20 hours a week. We terrified women with that idea. They believed it. You know what? It wasn't true.
Right.
The research came along and looked at hundreds of studies showing that you can put those babies in daycare. It's not going to interfere with the attachment or the bond that those babies have to their mothers. And it's not going to affect those kids 5 years from now, or 6 years from now, or 10 years from now.
Yeah.
But until the research got out there, many mothers would never have gone to work or felt guilty when they had to go to work and leave those young babies at home. It's hard to change people's minds.
Mm-hmm. But those were sort of, both of those examples were sort of fear-based.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a fear-based reasoning, in your view, to keep some of these myths, that keeps these myths around fathers and their capabilities alive? Is there a fear-based component to that?
Mm-hmm.
Like if we let dad do this, then X will happen, or is that the myth of the incompetent dad? So many of these things seem fear-based.
I think the fear that mothers might have is that fathers can't do it as well. Okay, and if you have that fear, then my goodness, you fear for your children that they won't do as well, or won't be as happy, or won't be as comfortable if dad does more of the parenting. So maybe the mother's fear is not so much she fears for herself, but she fears that this is going to have a negative impact on her kids, even though the research says that is not true. Okay. The father may fear that if he tries to do more of that parenting, that maybe his co-workers, his boss, the men that he's with, he may fear that they will think less of him. Stay-at-home fathers take a lot of flack.
Yeah.
They take a lot of flack for being stay-at-home fathers.
It's, there are many reasons why we use the term, lead dad. We define lead dad as the go-to parent, whether he works full-time, part-time, or devotes all of his time to his family. And that last category is, of course, what we say formerly known as stay-at-home dads. And we've really been deliberate in banging on and on and on about the term lead dad, just for that reason, to take some of the stigma and shame away from it, to normalize it, but also to show that you can be a lead dad and be, fully engaged in what you're doing. Yet I wonder, I think, when I left the New York Times at the end of 21 and the final column ran, a guy I'd known in my community for years and years and years came up and said, I'd like to be part of what you're doing. And I said, yeah, come on board. And he said, but just make sure, can I do it anonymously? And I said, maybe you saw an early draft, but we got rid of the part where we're going to take little puppies and throw them in the river. We thought that was off brand. And he just kind of stared blankly at me. I was like, I'm kidding. We're never going to throw puppies in the river. And he said, can you just do it anonymously? And he worked in real estate, and his wife had a very senior job at a law firm. And she certainly made more money than he did. And he was great dad. He was there, involved, working, still working, but it broke. I'll never forget it, but it broke my heart, because I believe there's so many more men out there who are lead dads. And you talked about the U.S. Census early on. That's how I sort of decided to leave the Times, start the company of dads. We did between the U.S. Census and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we very confidently can say there are somewhere around 20 to 25 million men in America who are lead dads or could be lead dads. Now, there are 125 million men overall. There's 75 million, dads. That's not everyone, but that's a substantial number. But so many of them are in the shadows. Now, every week, more people are reaching out to me, so that's positive. But, from your view and all the other examples you've given, from sort of American history, sociological examples, is it just the accretion of more and more research showing that these myths are just that, they're myths, that they're incorrect? Is that what it's going to take to allow fathers to confidently, positively, proactively step up and take this role, and moms to be able to have more freedom? Is it just that? Is that how it happens? This accretion of data that finally topples the myth?
Well, again, let's look at what happened with women and girls. How did we topple the myth that the woman couldn't be the lead economically in a family? How did we topple the myth that the woman couldn't be the lead in being more educated than her husband? Nowadays, more women are graduating from high school and college than men. Women are, at least this younger generation of women, they are taking the lead in terms of education and their future jobs. How did that happen? Again, to topple the myth there's not one or two approaches. It took a multitude of approaches to convince those little girls that this was possible for them, that they didn't have to worry about out earning their future husband and the parent of their children. They didn't have to worry about being more educated than him. So there's not a single approach to changing that. But I think if we look at Sweden, for example, they're doing it. Mm-hmm. You see those fathers out there with their babies. They have the paid paternity leaves. It's become more normal for men and women there to share the income earning and share the direct hands-on childcare. Yep. It took time, but they also changed their policies to make it possible for those mothers and fathers to do what they would want to do. The policies are there. We don't have that.
Mm-hmm. I was very optimistic. It's going to sound strange. I was very optimistic during COVID. I was very optimistic from a work parenting perspective that, all the horrible things that COVID did to the world, it allowed many of us to work fully remotely, and it showed companies and managers that people could do this. And the benefit of that was, moms and dads became engaged with their children in a different way. Some of that was frustrating. Nobody wants to go back to Zoom school while you're trying to work, but some of it was incredibly positive. And now, 3 years, a little over 3 years after, that lockdown began, certain companies in America are beginning to sort of, demand that people return to office, and demand that return to office, not for any good reason. I'm not a proponent of, everybody work willy-nilly. You have to come together. You have to have meetings. It's contact's important, but I'm more of a proponent of it being, deliberate and intentional. But big companies, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, I got off the phone with this sort of very upset father yesterday who works at a healthcare company, and he's really being squeezed for being the primary caregiver for their children. And they're starting to sort of, reflexively fall back on, well, you have to be in the office, and, your caregiving isn't my responsibility. Is that the arc of history? Do when you look at past examples, is it there usually a backlash and then we keep moving forward, or is this a sort of graver threat in your view to what people showed worked not perfectly but pretty well during COVID, and people were still productive, people still made money, and kids were cared for, and kids who hadn't seen their fathers were seeing a lot more of their fathers because they weren't relentlessly commuting to work.
Mm-hmm. I think COVID, and there was some interesting research that came out of that. Employed mothers and employed fathers during COVID Um, it was the fathers who said they most enjoyed the time with the children. And it was the fathers who were much more likely to say, I don't want to go back and do the number of hours and the kind of work that I was doing. I don't like it. I don't want to go back to that. The dads were more likely to say that than the moms were. But you're right. After COVID, we sort of slid back again because of what our employers expected, back into dad makes the money, mom can have the more flexible job. So unfortunately, COVID sort of was a window into what it could look like if companies allowed or promoted or encouraged this versus what happened once COVID disappeared. Moving forward, then steps back, steps forward, then steps back. I would like to see more steps forward and let COVID show us what could be, and let a country like Sweden show us what could be, which again, who's the beneficiary of this? It's not the father, it's not the mother. Let's keep the focus on where it should be. It's the kids who are going to benefit from this. More fathering time benefits kids. Focus on the kids. Say the F word. Fathers, 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 fathers. More of the F word. Fathers, fathers. If we could get more fathering in there, we know from the research that the kids are the ones who benefit.
Yeah.
Okay. We have 50% of the children in this country, 50% spend part of their childhood living away from their father. 50%. Those children are being father deprived instead of father enriched. The research shows us that father enriched is better than father deprived. Father deprived is also the father who's working 50 and 60 hours a week. Those children are father deprived. So that's where our focus needs to be in terms of getting rid of the myths and the lies. We owe it to the kids to zap the vampires and the zombies, which are the myths and the lies that are so hard to get rid of.
Professor Nielsen, thank you for being my guest on the Company of Dads podcast today. I'll never think of the F word the same again. So it was a great place to end. Thank you very much.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Company of Dads podcast. I also want to thank the people who make this podcast and everything else that we do at the Company of Dads possible. Helder Mira, who is our audio producer, Lindsay Decker, who handles all of our social media, Terry Brennan, who's helping us with the newsletter and audience acquisition, Emily Servin, who is our web maestro, and of course, Evan Roosevelt, who is working side by side with me in many of the things that we do here at the Company of Dads. It's a great team, and we're just trying to bring you the best in fatherhood. Remember, the one-stop shop for everything is our newsletter, The Dad. Sign up at thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. Thank you again for listening.